Okay, hi. Good afternoon, good noon, everybody. Welcome to the East Tennessee History Center. I'm Dr. Warren Doctor. I just want to thank you all for coming out to our brown bag lunch today. We're very excited about today's talk with one of our local celebrities. And a man who really needs no introduction, so I have a really easy job today. But before I do, let me, a few things I just want to thank our sponsors, Knoxville Community Media, the Knoxville County Public Library System, and First Bank who help fund this and put this on. I would also like to encourage everybody in the room to become a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society so we can continue to put these things on. I'm contractually obligated to ask that. And if you want to leave your email and stuff, there's a place you can do that by the door. Some of the things that we have coming up on September 18th, which is an evening talk I'm really looking forward to by Dr. Lucas Kelly about, it's called Chickasaw Surveyors and Cherokee Soldiers and American Spectators. And it's about map making and the early tribes here in East Tennessee. That'll be really interesting. And on September 23rd, we're having a how to use research in the McClung Historical Collection, which will also be in the evening for people that are interested in doing their own genealogical research. And then later in October, on October 18th, we're having a historical newspapers online workshop to teach people how to use online resources and digital newspapers. So we have a lot of stuff going on, and I again just want to thank you for coming out. Our speaker today, who will be speaking on the music history of Knoxville, is someone I used to read when I was in college, so I always enjoy introducing Jack, because I also started reading him his secret history in the Metro Pulse more than 20 years ago. And of course, he is the director of the Knoxville History Project. Paul James is here with him today, and he's authored over 20 books about the history of Knoxville. And I bet there's not a person in this room who doesn't know the name Jack Neely, which is pretty cool. Unless Jack doesn't know his own name. But without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Jack Neely. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Warren. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Paul, James and I, and Paul takes everything I do and makes it digestible, I think, and attractive. But we came up with the literary guide a few years ago, and it was a kind of a hit, kind of covered all the questions people ask about Knoxville literature, and thought we'd put it in a pocket-sized guide, and thought we'd do the same thing with music, the other thing that Knoxville's kind of well known for. And I came up with a draft and thought it was going to be, I thought I was being careful and concise with my draft. And just putting what absolutely had to be in there. And I gave it to Paul. He said, Jack, we really need to take out about 8,000 words. And we did, we cut it way back, and that's what we have today. I have to say, I'm sure a lot of people will pick up this and they'll thumb to the glossary of people, of musicians, and your favorite musician won't be in there, and they'll say, what kind of a piece of crap is this? And actually some of my favorite musicians are not in there too. I mean, R.B. Morris has been a friend of mine for 40 years, and I've been to 50 of his shows and enjoyed every one of them. I actually went on tour with Scott Miller for 2 weeks on his tour of the East Coast, and every show was really great. This is not necessarily the best musicians. I think R.B. and Scott Miller and a lot of other people are better musicians than some of the people in this book, but the people in the booklet are people who were there and at a critical time and kind of made a shift in music history. And the people in the book are often people you may not have heard of, but there were people who did make a difference. But some of them are people you've heard of, and we'll be talking about some of those today. But I just want to say that I have lost sleep over the glossary, who to include before and after we published the thing. So that I just want to put that out there. But anyway, the history of music in Knoxville is pretty fascinating, and not necessarily what we expect. There are a lot of truisms. A lot of us grew up with truisms about Knoxville, especially in country music, and how Nashville stole country music from us, or that Knoxville kicked it out because we were too embarrassed about it. And none of these are exactly exactly true, and in fact, some of them are completely untrue. But the story, the real story, is pretty fascinating and maybe harder to believe than the stories we grew up hearing. Going all the way back, and I don't know anywhere else to go with history, you have to start at the beginning. The earliest references to music we know of in Knoxville are some advertisements for violins in the 1790s. The first people who lived here, the very first Knoxvillians, were at least interested in violins. A lot of the music from the era before the Civil War, and there's not a lot, if you've done any research about in the pre-Civil War era, you know that newspapers didn't write about everything. They told people about things around the world that they thought people here didn't know about, and they thought if there was something obvious that was happening in town, people would know about it, and they wouldn't have to put it in the paper. But this was so journalism isn't the best way. It isn't comprehensive in terms of looking at cultural stuff in the pre-Civil War era, especially. But there are a few interesting clues, and some of them have to do with music being associated with marginalized groups. By the way, this is a very early drawing of Knoxville that Paul found, that we found useful for talking about things we don't have pictures of. But it's interesting to find out, you don't see a lot of descriptions of people performing music in Knoxville before the Civil War, but you do see a few surprising things. One is these advertisements for looking for black men escaping slavery, and you see these all over the place in early newspapers. And they're often described in greater detail than we usually described white people from that era. Often we don't even know what important white people looked like. We don't know what James White looked like. He was never described in the kind of detail that you see in an escaped slave advertisement. But in a lot of these advertisements, surprisingly many, several at least that I found, black men are described as being proficient on the fiddle. And that was one of their defining characteristics. And it doesn't say who they played fiddle for, what kind of tunes they played on fiddle, or whether it was for black or white audiences or both. We don't know. It's an intriguing mystery. Another thing that we've learned about is that some of the first professional musicians in Knoxville were not necessarily performers, public performers, but they were music teachers at the Female Academy. We had boys' private schools as well as girls' private schools here, but they seem to have taught music only at the girls' schools. And they taught piano, violin, and voice especially in the private schools, and they would occasionally have recitals at least once a year. And that was a rare opportunity to hear music as early as the 1820s at the Female Academy, and they had women, usually women, who were teaching, sometimes men who were teaching music to these young women in the Female Academy. We know something about publishing books about shape note singing. Shape note singing was a big part of early country music, and we know that the Carter family was influenced by their family shape note singing tradition of the 19th century. This really unusual, looking back on it, kind of vocal singing. And several books about shape singing were published here in Knoxville, including the Harp of Columbia and later the New Harp of Columbia. They got some national currency, these books. They're basically hymnals, but with shapes for notes. But there's also a book that came out before all those called the Knoxville Harmony. It was published not here, but in Madisonville. And what they meant to imply by Knoxville Harmony is one of the mysteries. I have not found a single account of a shape note singing presentation or concert or whatever in Knoxville during this period. But I don't doubt they existed. There are a few rare concerts that we do have examples of, and this is maybe the first one that I've run across. This is at Mr. Ray's Hotel. A guy named Mr. and Mrs. Richardson and his wife, Mrs. Richardson. They were singers from Philadelphia, and they were here in 1819. Now, if you don't know Ray's Hotel, that was the building, I'm glad to say, is still there. It's the Mar House, the front of the Bijou Theater. So it's interesting, the Bijou Theater is famous for performances today, and the first concert I know of any sort was this one. There might have been earlier ones somewhere else, but that's interesting. By the way, Archibald Ray, who ran Ray's Hotel, was very proud of his own voice, and he was in fact the precentor, which is a term we don't use anymore. But that was like the Presbyterian version of a Jewish cantor in a service. He would be at Presbyterian Church and he would lead the congregation in singing. So he was doing that while he was also occasionally hosting these musical events. And this was an interesting one that I just threw in that wanted to mention. 1847 at City Hotel, the same building. Joel Sweeney was there. He was an early innovator, kind of a famous guy in retrospect. He was an innovator of the banjo. The banjo was not that well known at the time, and he was a guy that innovated. Some people say he added the fifth string to it. I don't know if that's true or not, but he was definitely a promoter of banjo in America, not just in this part of the country. But he was here and giving concerts when Knoxville was a town of fewer than 2,000 people. He was here. But this was, but he was there. And here's another really oddity. It's the celebrated English dwarf, General Tom Thumb. Of course, it wasn't English, but he was an American. But by this time, he'd done a command performance for Queen Victoria, and that might have been why they thought he was English. But he was at the courthouse, which was over near where the courthouse is today. But he was. People might have regarded him as a freak show, but he was a singing performer. That was what he was doing in 1849. So these are a few just kind of oddities. I don't know if they mean anything or not. There were descriptions of Knoxville as kind of culturally deficient in these days, and a lot of people say they come here and say there's really not much going on here, is there? And one in particular, John Mitchell, the Irish refugee fugitive who came here in 1853, described Knoxville's culture as gloomy, is what he said. It was that there wasn't any culture except for music and churches. And he said, with the exception of a lively contingent of Swiss immigrants, and they were doing some interesting things here. He doesn't describe in great detail what that is, but this changed very soon in the mid-19th century as we received a lot more immigrants from other countries, especially German-speaking immigrants. And a lot of American cities received a lot of German refugees after the revolutions of 1848, which changed American culture in lots of ways, top to bottom. Brought us beer and Christmas trees and all sorts of things. But it also, we're lucky in Knoxville we got this particular guy to land here because he was not just your typical immigrant. He'd been a performer in Mendelssohn's orchestra in Leipzig. He was from Leipzig and came here and wanted to do the kind of music that he was used to. He had known the Schumanns. He'd actually Richard Wagner. He knew him back in Leipzig, but he came here and wanted to do something in Knoxville, maybe that would remind him of home. But he played the French horn, and he was a composer. But in Knoxville, he was kind of an impresario of voice. And he went to all the churches, and he identified the best singers and the choirs in the churches and brought them together to try to do something different, and that was to sing operatic music, contemporary opera music in Knoxville. And it was an ambitious but and surprising but immediately successful thing. It's amazing how much Knoxville bloomed right after the Civil War. It became really a different place. And in some ways it was a different place because we had about 4 or 5 times as many people as we had in town and back around 1850. And most of them were from far away. A lot of them were from far away, from Ireland, from Switzerland, from various German states, Austria, and so forth. But they all came here and they brought their own culture. And also there were the black people who were freed, and they were suddenly doing things out in public as well. So this was maybe the most exciting time to live in Knoxville, culturally at least, between 1866 and 1880 or 1890, that period. And that's when a lot of this stuff just exploded. It was really a big bang of music in a lot of ways. But Gustavus Canava was the guy that started this group called the Knoxville Philharmonic, which sounds highfalutin, but it was attractive to a lot of people who performed here. And another immigrant who was here was a guy named Peter Staub, very popular here, and actually he He crossed the ocean several times in his life. He'd been Swiss consul in America. He'd been later American consul in Switzerland. In the meantime, was elected mayor twice. Was a commissioner to several World's Fairs in Paris. So he got around, and he knew a good deal about the world culture when he was here. But he built us not long after he arrived in 1872. Built Staub's Opera House. But this was really the most extravagant and best building probably in the city of Knoxville in 1872. This was a place that made a lot of things possible. Canava, with his early experiments, they had to content themselves with Masonic halls and Turner Hall, which was the German hall, and it held maybe 400 people or so. But Staub's held more than 1,000 people, so they could have big shows here, and they did have big shows here. In the very first year this was open, they had, I think, the first really big name of the 19th century. The first big name to perform in Knoxville, other than Tom Thumb, was a guy named Ole Bull. If you know, you may not recognize that name, but he was a very famous Norwegian violinist. A lot of people, including Schumann, thought that he was the best living violinist in the world, and he was here performing at Staub's Opera House the very first year. I'm pretty sure that Canava knew Ole Bull, but when I mentioned that Ole Bull performed here once to Ashley Capps, who does the Big Ears Festival and a lot of other things, he was just astonished to hear that, because he says Ole Bull is still sacrosanct in the Scandinavian nations, and is much inspiring even to avant-garde artists today. But he was there. But they also had operatic performances there, and sometimes full operas, but more often people performing arias from operas, and often local people like Sue Boyd Barton, a member of the Boyd family of Blunt Mansion, who was kind of our local who they compare her to. She was our Jenny Lind is what they said, but she had a beautiful voice, and had an interesting story too that was kind of operatic in itself. But anyway, the Germans dominated, but there were other immigrant groups at the same time that had their own musical traditions, especially Irish, who were known for dances. And you would occasionally hear about Irish people playing Irish jigs at dances and that sort of thing. That was the Irish who were here fleeing the famine in Ireland, mostly Catholic Irish. And also the Welsh, who came here mainly looking for work in the iron and coal business, which is what they'd done back in Wales. The Welsh are especially interesting because they were a very musical culture. They were a singing culture, and even the guys who worked in the coal mines would sing in choruses in the mines. But they came here and settled in Mechanicsville because it was near the iron company where a lot of them worked. And I love the stories that I've heard of the Welsh people in Mechanicsville going in their backyard after supper and beginning to sing a Welsh hymn. And without seeing this person, other people would join in. And after a while, the whole neighborhood would be singing the same hymn. It's a really charming image. But they actually had some organized things too called the Eisted Fod, which was a giant, a great big vocal presentation and competitive. They would choose the best singers of the Eisted Fod. And these were sometimes, one of them at least was advertised nationally, and people came here from other states to go to the Welsh Eisted Fod in Mechanicsville. It was not downtown; it was in their church in Mechanicsville. But I'm just saying, and also there were black brass bands in this era who were competing with each other. There were two bands who were always trying to outdo each other, showing up at political events and that sort of thing, and playing. And I wish we could find out more about what kind of music they were playing, but it was probably band music of the era. So you have this great stew of different kinds of people here, and that's what makes it a lot of fun. The Mozart Club is interesting, and that was different from the Philharmonic Society. This was a group of admirers of Mozart who actually established their own their own venue, which was called the Mozart Hall. They already had Staub's Opera House, but down the street, in fact, Mozart Hall was about where the Couch Park extension is now. But Mozart Hall was not a big place. They had a lot of rooms, maybe about this size, where they could put on events, and including small operettas like Gilbert and Sullivan. Some of the early Gilbert and Sullivan operettas were put on there. And but they would have rooms for recitals and practicing and that sort of thing. Sometimes had little art shows and things there. But that's an interesting just part of this whole era. By the way, I've written a lot about this in a piece that's free to read on our website called the Ne Plus Ultra, which is what they called, somebody called Sue Boyd Barton, the singer, I think, but about this sudden and I think sincere fascination with European opera in Knoxville in the latter third of the 19th century. So what does this have to do with anything else? We might wonder that, but actually has a lot to do with what happened after that. They had in the 1880s had sometimes called the June Festival, sometimes called the Spring Festival, but it was usually about a 4-day event, and this was a big deal downtown. As you can see, if you can look at some of these names, a lot of these are famous people who scholars of music today would recognize. Emma Uke was one of them, and she was, and I mentioned that she had been in town. Somebody, Daniel Berry from WOT at the time, called me and said, I'm flabbergasted. I didn't know that she was ever in Tennessee. But she was at the festival and was the featured performer one time. She was an Austrian singer. But also look down, there's Victor Herbert's name. That is the Victor Herbert, who's the famous composer. That he was just an instrumentalist at this time. But so this was a big deal that attracted a lot of attention. Adele Auster-Oy was a protege of Franz Liszt and had played with him in Europe. So these were big deals, and most of these happened at Staub's Opera House. But they would sometimes try to be more democratic and have it out. There was their ticketed things, would have a big free show at what became Chalaway Park outside. So it was a fascinating time and very similar in some ways to Big Ears because it was 4 days long and was always had a surprise to it, including this surprise. This was something that had nothing to do with the European opera that they were doing. This is in 1883, May of 1883. They had a bit of a surprise, and this wasn't completely sanctioned, but it was it was okayed by the festival people, but organized by other people. This was a surprise event on a Saturday afternoon after the last opera event had happened in Staub's Opera House. And they said, we're going to have something a little bit different for y'all. Keep your seats. And they had about 14 fiddlers come out. Knights of the Bow, they called them. And they were from all over the place. They were from not just East Tennessee, but Kentucky and North Carolina. They all came, the best of the fiddlers in the whole region came here and had a little impromptu fiddling contest. And these people dressed in tuxedos and so forth through the opera festival loved it. They were fascinated with it. And they kept calling them back for more. And they started talking about this. Why can't we do this all the time? In fact, we started doing that all the time. Began having these annual fiddling festivals, fiddling contests that were usually at Market Square. But this was looking back on this, and I've talked to some country music scholars about this. Was this the first country music concert in history? I don't know that it wasn't. I've tried to use search terms and so forth and find something like this that happening elsewhere. Sometimes there's a small fiddling contest in Pennsylvania or somewhere, but this was the first time I know of that you had a lot of people in an auditorium listening to country music, and that's what they were playing. And of course, Arkansas Traveler, the very common fiddle tunes of the era, and that are still well known today. And by the way, mentioned Ole Bull. He actually closed his mostly classical performance at Staub's with Arkansas Traveler, and that surprised everybody at the end too. And I think kind of endeared him to the audience. But another person who kind of helped throttle things along was Bob Taylor, a politician a guy who ran for governor in 1886 against his own brother, Alf Taylor. I'm sure you've heard stories about that. One was a Republican, one a Democrat. And they were both fiddlers. And I would love to think that the legends that they fiddled, instead of debating, they fiddled against each other on stage. I would love to think those are true. I don't know that that's been substantiated. But anyway, Bob Taylor was unlike his older brother, was a very charismatic guy that just really got people's attention. And was very popular, would give kind of these talks that were kind of motivational speeches, and just they would bring in lots of people, and then he'd fiddle a little bit at Staub's Opera House. But he was from Carter County, but moved to Knoxville for several years in the 1880s and 90s. And if anybody knows about in the Fourth and Guild, people talk about the old governor's mansion. It wasn't the governor's mansion literally, but it's where he lived for a while after he was elected governor. But an interesting guy, he was with a group called the Market House Fiddlers for a while that performed here, but was, I think, part of the scene here. And as I understand, he had an office in this building in the Custom House at one time between his governor period and his senator period. But a very, very interesting fellow. And by the way, the great uncle of Ann Taylor of NPR fame, as well as the grandfather of Peter Taylor, the Pulitzer-winning novelist. So a very, very interesting and creative family. I've got some more other stories about him, but I think we'll move on. Another interesting person who came here during the end of this period, this kind of blooming of both classical and fiddle music, was Bertha Roth, her name was, when she first arrived here from Cincinnati in 1902. She was a violinist, conservatory trained in Cincinnati, came here and as a violin teacher here. She performed in hotels occasionally, put together a quartet to begin with, and really was a perfectionist about sounding perfect and having only the best people in her quartet. But she really turned people's heads when she got here, just for her. We had never probably had a violinist quite of her ability before she arrived. But she was eventually put together more than a quartet, what she called her little symphony. You may not recognize it, but this is right across the street at the Farragut Hotel, was now the Hyatt Place. I'm sorry this room doesn't exist anymore, but they call it the Oak Room. But this is where she had her performances of her little symphony, and I'm not sure they had much more room for an audience than they did for the symphony themselves, but it became a regular thing, and it was impressive to people. And it wasn't that little, as you see. There were probably 25 pieces or so in there. But she got ideas, and by 1935 she had founded the Knoxville Symphony Orchestra. She is the founder of the KSO that we have today, which is the oldest continually operating symphony orchestra in the Southeast. She's remembered as not only the founder but the first conductor. And even today, female conductors are kind of unusual and the cause for news stories. But she was doing it back in 1935. But we owe her a lot for founding this great symphony that we still have. But she was here. I mean, and to think that she founded that at the same time as a lot of other things were going on in country music that I'll mention in a little bit. I'm going to skip that for just a minute. The same, while all this stuff was going on in the official halls, there were also street musicians, and street musicians go back to the years just after the Civil War, and a lot of them hung around the train stations. There was some discussion of street musicians as early as 1880 or so, I found, but they would play for nickels or whatever, and were generally appreciated, I think. But they often hung around the Southern Railway, and that was a place they always had a fresh audience every day. And even though they were surprisingly often singing songs of railroad tragedies, you'd think that they would be run off by the Southern people, but they weren't. Before George Renaud, we have him and a picture of him because we know what he looked like. His predecessor there, we don't know what he looks like. He looked like, his name was Charlie Oakes, and even though he did make some records in the 1920s, he's a pretty mysterious character who was in Knoxville for about 40 years that we know of, sometimes in and out. Essentially, fascinating about these country musicians, that a lot of them were bohemians, more or less, and they kind of lived on the edge of society, dressed differently, often had alcohol problems, and lived differently. But Charlie Oakes was kind of well known around the train station and wrote the first song about the Southern Railway wreck, the Newmarket train wreck of 1904. We unfortunately don't know what it sounded like, but we have the lyrics because they're very gory lyrics. Because someone collected them even when he was still alive, they thought this was interesting enough to put in an academic journal. But Charlie Oakes, like I say, lived into the recording era, but mainly was known as a street musician in Knoxville. By the way, he played guitar and also played harmonica. And some people have claimed that he's the first guy to devise a harmonica holder that you didn't have to use your hands for. I don't know if that's true or not. But of course, Bob Dylan was grateful for that many years later. But George Renaud, who also worked with Charlie Oakes, and all these guys were blind, by the way. And this was the only way they had to make a living. And the fact is that making a living as street musicians was not something you would do if you could do anything else. And I think that's why we have so many blind people. Mac and Bob, and a lot of these people were blind and were playing in the streets of Knoxville. But George Renaud was a younger guy, and I want to mention him in particular here because this was his favorite corner, where the weather station is, corner of Clinch and Market. He would be there on a regular basis, and liked to play there because people would come to check on the weather, and it was a great place to make a few nickels. He is kind of an interesting guy in terms of workers' rights and for music because he was arrested several times for begging. People didn't understand. Policemen would see him. Gosh, he's collecting money in the street. He's a beggar. Let's take him to jail. And he was jailed several times, but every time it got to a judge, the judge said, "This guy's not bothering anybody." And they finally wrote it into the law: don't arrest these people anymore. They're people don't have to give them money if they don't want to. But he was, by the way, he made a lot of records and up in New York. This is before the Bristol sessions, by the way, made his own records. The best known of which is the very first version of the one we know as on Top of Old Smoky. And this was in 1925, and this was the same time we changed our baseball team's name to the Smokies, and the same time that we were talking about building a national park in the Smokies. This was the part of this kind of multi-pronged cultural attack on the Smoky Mountains that he was just kind of responding to all this excitement about the Smoky Mountains. Here in town. He had in spite of the fact he made several recordings that were released nationally and reputedly made some money on that. It was only for 2 or 3 years that he was a star. Then he was kind of forgotten, and by the time he was 30, he was back on the streets, begging again, and he eventually died in his 30s of tuberculosis. And I'm not completely sure that the guy on the cover is not George Renaud. He often went around with his wife. This is a blind man singing, and he looks. The only thing that makes me think it's not him is he looks too old to be George Renaud, who died at the age of 38. But then he had a very tough life, especially the last few years of it. But these people all had an impact on the whole thing. He was making records, 1924, 25, and a lot of that was thanks to Sturkey Brothers Furniture. They were the people who heard that George Renaud was playing music in the streets, and this was. It's surprising to think that a furniture company would be that interested in recorded music, but remember, records in those days were considered accessories to phonographs, and phonographs were furniture. So if you're buying records before World War II, you would go to a furniture company, and that's the only place that advertised records in the 20s and 30s, no matter what kind of records it was. But Sturkey Brothers were perplexed that people weren't buying phonographs, even though phonographs had gotten cheaper. Phonographs had been popular with wealthy people early on, but they'd gotten a lot cheaper about 1920. And they said, why aren't working people buying phonographs? And somebody said, well, it's because you don't have the kind of music they like, and y'all do some of this country music. And they actually collected some street buskers like George Renault and Charlie Oakes and Mac and Bob, and sent them to New York on the train to make records in New York, because of course there wasn't any recording business in Nashville yet. It was the main recording business in America was in New York, and that's where he went. They even sent Uncle Dave Macon there. Uncle Dave Macon, who was later the first big star of the Grand Ole Opry, but then just a musician sometimes hanging around Knoxville, and banjo player. They sent him, his first records were made for Sturkey as well. This was a place where they sold their records. And by the way, I skipped over. I want to just go back to the Bijou Theater, and I meant to mention that in context with the KSO. This is where the KSO performed in the early days when it first got together and they were bringing in audiences. Bertha Wahlberg Clark. But of course, it was known for vaudeville. It was known for Broadway shows. It was known for lots and lots of things. We're 1909. We're lucky we still have it. It's considered one of the best sounding rooms in America, according to New York Times critics. But it's and a big part of the Big Ears Festival. I think they have as many as 40 performers there at Big Ears at the Bijou. But we just finished a book called The Second Balcony, which is about the black experience with the Bijou Theater. Of course, it was always a segregated theater, but at a time when a lot of theaters were turning all white, that were not even admitting black people under any circumstances, the Bijou kept its second balcony open. And there's a lot of black history, a lot more black history to that theater than we've talked about. They're talking about restoring the second balcony, and that's why they're interested in telling its story. But back to Sturkey Brothers, by the way, was involved in some recordings that happened in 1929, 1930, organized by the Brunswick-Vilcalion Company, one of the biggest record companies in America at the time, competing with Victor and Columbia, to have a big kind of extended field sessions in Knoxville to see what they would find here, and they found a lot. So much that the Bear Family Records of Germany collected all this stuff they did and put it out in this big box set called the Knoxville Sessions. Was not nominated for a Grammy, by the way, for its research. But this all happened on Wall Avenue over on just on the other side of Market Square. There a lot of people, black, white, country, jazz, a lot of different kinds of performers came there, and they recorded all thanks to Dick Voynow, who was at the controls. Dick Voynow was the pianist for Big Spiderbeck's Wolverines many of years earlier. But so this was considered something of national interest. I think the Depression had something to do with why it didn't do as well, but as they hoped. But here's one of the bands that performed here, the Maynard's Southline Serenaders. This Maynard Baird, the band leader, and this was, he played all around town, but also went on tour a good deal, was often playing for dances up north, was on the radio on WNOX in those days, but very smooth 1920s dance jazz is what Maynard Baird did, kind of a predecessor to the big band era. And you might recognize the Wayside Inn there was oh gosh, why did I do that? I'm going, you're going the wrong direction, yeah. What? Whoops. Sorry, spoiler alert. Down there, the Wayside Inn, I was just going to mention in the corner, that was in Bearden, you may know, was the place that we remember most recently as Naples, was where they had shows sometimes as late as midnight there, mainly for the traveling public who were staying in the motels around there. Other performers who were at the St. James Hotel doing for these sessions were the Tennessee Chocolate Drops, as they were known at the time, and that included Howard Louis Bluyer Armstrong, who was a master of the mandolin and the violin, and Carl Martin. These are both guys who lived together in Knoxville in the 1920s for probably 10 or 12 years and performed on the streets in the 1920s, and some of the more interesting people you would find. But they played with country, what instruments we think of as country music, string instruments, but they played jazzy tunes, and kind of like what would later be associated with Django Reinhardt. They were doing this kind of thing in the 20s, and actually made some of these records for Brunswick Wilcallion. Apparently didn't ever get anything from them. I don't know whether they were sold or not, but they were both interesting guys. By the way, of course, La Follette has its Louis Blues Festival every year, and that's coming up in a few days or weeks, I think. So look that up. They have that's his childhood home, La Follette. He kind of came here to perform, but interesting story. And he lived for a long time. He was performing here in Knoxville in the 1990s. But another performer at those sessions was Leola Manning, who was unknown before or after, but for a short time. In the late 20s and early 30s, she was drawing crowds. She had a beautiful voice, a blues voice, although she hated the word blues. It was she sang in a blues style, but she even she was so religious, she thought the sexual connotations of blues music were not something she wanted to get involved with. In fact, she had a record called "The Blues Is All Wrong." But this is one of her sides that she cut at the St. James Sessions. "Satan is Busy in Knoxville," and it's not about vice, as you might think from her point of view, but it's about murders. It's about a series of murders in Knoxville. She would write true songs about real things she read about in the papers. "Satan is Busy in Knoxville" was about murders that you can look up in the newspaper, and they're described just as she described them in the song. But also the arcade building "Moan," which is about a terrible fire on Union Avenue that killed several people. But that was all something that actually happened. She wrote and recorded these songs just days after these events happened. And that you just wonder what would have happened if she kept at it. Her family says she just never even talked about it. She just moved on to her religious life and just never really did anything else after 1931 or so, and was forgotten at the time of her death, but was kind of rediscovered in Austria by the way of some of these rare recordings that made it over there and actually got onto some CD collections. And she's better known now than she was in her lifetime. All right, here's one that requires some background. Roy Acuff and his Crazy Tennesseans. Roy Acuff, he's claimed by Union County, and of course that's where he spent his childhood. But he moved to Knoxville when he was 15 or 16 with his family, and immediately became famous here, not for playing music, even though his family had some music going on in it. He was not that interested in music as a young man. He was an athlete, and he was an athlete at Central High, and he was a triple threat. He was a football, basketball, baseball. He was great at everything, just a brilliant athlete, and everybody was kind of scared of him because he was very aggressive. He wasn't afraid of anybody on the basketball court or in the football field or whatever, at home plate or whatever. He was a tough guy and a fine athlete. And like a lot of people who athletic stars in high school, he didn't know what to do after he graduated, and he got in trouble a lot. The first several hundred times you see Roy Acuff's name mentioned, it's as a champion athlete. The next few dozen times you see it mentioned, it's as a criminal. He's being arrested for one thing or another. Nothing major, bootlegging or gambling or assault a few times. He was actually shot once at a bootlegging joint in Fountain City. And this is a detail that has not made it into any of his biographies, including his autobiography. But he actually went to St. Mary's Hospital. I guess got better. But he didn't know what to do. He had been wishing to be a baseball star. He wanted to play pro baseball, and things weren't working out for him. And finally, he started having a series of heat strokes. And a doctor said, "You really shouldn't be outside very much, young man." and he said, "What can I do?" And he picked up a fiddle and started playing with it. Dealt with a guy that ran a gas station in Fountain City who had some experience in vaudeville, and worked on his stage presentation and his violin style, and got some attention. In 1932, he performed at the Tennessee Theater for a talent show. He came in second, but he said later on he said that there were so many good musicians here, I wouldn't have expected to do any better. He was heartened by coming in second. But kept playing more and more, and he developed a stage show that was unlike any other musician stage show, because he had a really aggressive presence, energetic presence, kind of like he did on the basketball court, but was kind of in your face and in a way that got people's attention. He would do tricks. He would do like sound effects. He would do like to bring in unexpected guests. Performers, sometimes as many as 14 people on stage at once, all playing fiddle. So this was kind of a shocking thing to people at the time. He almost reminds me a little bit of punk rock and kind of his sudden bursting onto the scene, upending all the expectations. He didn't always wear a coat and tie. He was just a brash young man playing music his own way, and that was how he became known, how he presented himself. And it was such a sensation that he was on one radio station after another. He was on WNOX until WROL offered him more money. He went to them, but when he was on WNOX, they were performing on the top floor of the Andrew Johnson Hotel, and they finally had to evict them because all these rowdy fans were coming up and down using up the elevator, so the regular guests couldn't use them. But they were evicted. They moved into an abandoned boxing ring for a while, and then ended up on Market Square in the Market Hall, which was owned by the city. And that was kind of a problem but it shows you what a sensation he was. When he was performing on Market Square at the Market Hall, the movie theaters downtown, who were always expecting, they were showing cowboy movies on Saturdays, and their clientele, who were boys and young men mainly, were all at the Roy Acuff show, and they said, "You can't subsidize this guy; he's stealing our business." But he kept trying different things, and one of the different things he tried was he met in a drugstore on Broadway. He met the guy on the left there. And you notice he's playing an instrument that would not have been familiar to anybody before about 1935. It's called a dobro. And we think of a dobro as being an old-fashioned thing today, but it was completely new and kind of shocking to people in 1935. And to understand it, you have to go to understand the Hawaiian music craze, which had started back in 1915 or so. This is crazy to realize, but Sturkey Brothers Furniture, I mentioned, was selling records. They were selling Hawaiian music records in 1915, 8 years before the first known country music recordings were ever made. So we had a lot more Hawaiian music here than country music in the World War I era. And Hawaiian music was fascinating to people. We had lots of Hawaiian troops, including Hawaiians themselves, were in town at vaudeville shows, especially the Grand Theater, which you don't hear much about anymore, but it was near the Bijou. But they had a whole series of these troops who came through, and they played this bizarre instrument, the steel guitar. It looked like a guitar, but it sounded completely different from anything anybody had ever heard. And it wasn't made out of steel. It was a guitar played with a steel bar on it that made these kind of whining sounds. That I've seen so many descriptions of these. Say you won't believe to hear this, and they were talking this weird dreamy music. And I've found 7 or 8 descriptions of this that all include the word weird. In 1915, but weird in an appealing way. You'll be charmed by the weird beauty of it. But people loved Hawaiian music, and they loved the steel guitar sound. We think of this as being so southern. If you do a movie documentary about Mississippi, you'll probably hear a steel guitar right in the opening credits or whatever. But this is all, and also in Nashville, it's one of the basic sounds of Nashville country music as well. But none of this existed before the 20th century, and this was all this sudden big change. It was a novelty, And when the dobro was created by the Hungarian Dopira brothers in the Bay area of California, they thought to capitalize on the Hawaiian music craze. It was a resonator guitar that sounded loud, louder than you expect a guitar to sound without amplification. And this was something that didn't catch on for some reason. I think the Hawaiian thing was kind of over with on the West Coast, but some people on the East Coast, including this guy Clell Summy from the Smoky Mountains, saw a dobro somewhere, picked it up, learned how to play it, and it was his ticket to making money in Knoxville. And he began playing this in places, like I say, Roy Acuff heard him in a drugstore on Broadway and said, "Join my band right now, please." And he joined the Crazy Tennesseans. And the dobro is featured in their very first recording, which was The Great Speckled Bird, which was a national hit in 1938, and what got them on the Grand Ole Opry. And I always say that Nashville didn't steal country music. Our country musicians went there because they had a great radio tower there. That was the WSM radio tower, would reach all over the middle part of the country, from Chicago to New Orleans. Knoxville, WNOX would sometimes reach New Jersey on a nice evening, but it didn't compare to WSM, and that's why so many people went to Nashville to record. But again, Roy Acuff combined a lot of things, vaudeville stuff, vaudeville chops with Hawaiian music, and became a country star, and kind of the definitive country star. When Roy Acuff, we'd heard of the Grand Ole Opry before Roy Acuff got there, but if you look at references to the Grand Ole Opry in national records, it just shoots up. Suddenly references to the Grand Ole Opry skyrocket after Roy Acuff gets there in 1938. And this is before they moved into the Ryman Auditorium, but that was, suddenly they had big enough crowds that they needed a big place like the Ryman to move into. So he really was the juggernaut that made the Grand Ole Opry famous. But I could go on about Roy Acuff. We've kind of forgotten him, but he's this guy. When we talk about he was from Union County and went to the Bright Lights of Nashville. They don't mention 20 years in between. He was in Knoxville, and this is where he lived and where he performed and where he really created his persona. But another guy from Union County is Chet Atkins, and he came here right after Roy Acuff left. They'd never worked together in Knoxville, but he was a teenager and had asthma, so he wasn't fit for service in World War II, but began performing first as a fiddler. You see him with a fiddle on the right side there. But then began working with the guitar, he didn't consider himself a country musician. He considered himself a jazz musician. He was fascinated, as many of the musicians were backstage at the WNOX just down the street, with this phenomenon in Europe named Django Reinhardt, and they would play Django Reinhardt records there, and would play. And Roy Acuff said, "I want to sound like that guy." And he, in his autobiography, says, "My style that everybody talks about so much is really just me failing to sound like Django Reinhardt." But Django Reinhardt, of course, the Hot Club of France. He was mainly in Europe. He toured America once in 1946. But working with Stefan Grappelli in France was a big name in string jazz, kind of bringing the guitar and jazz to the fore. But Chet Atkins was playing this and did a lot of different kinds of things with his life, but was still advertising. The first time he ever did a solo show in Knoxville, he described himself as a jazz performer, Chet Atkins. But of course was later a producer in Nashville and was working with the Everly Brothers and Patsy Cline and lots of other people over the years. But a fascinating and multifaceted life. But spent not as long as Roy Acuff here, probably 3 or 4 years. Came back with the Carter family in the late 40s and worked with them a little bit here as well. But about the same time, Swan Silvertones, a black gospel group from West Virginia originally, but came down here to accept a job by Swan's Bakery. The building's still standing on Magnolia Avenue. A big bakery that wanted to sponsor Swans on the radio and WBIR, and did that. That's second guy from the left is Claude Jeter, who was kind of the amazing high note singer of this band that they really got a lot of attention, got some attention. Then they made some move to Philadelphia, I think, and made some records up there. But their records didn't really get around until the 60s, and suddenly people started passing around Swan Silvertone records backstage at Woodstock and places like that, and so you got to hear this, and that's why there's so many people from Paul Simon. Paul Simon said he wrote Bridge Over Troubled Water, inspired directly by a Swan Silvertone's record. John Fogerty, believe it or not, Creedence Clearwater Revival, said they were a big inspiration to him. Most surprising, Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead said they were always listening to Swan Silvertones, and that was just part of their mantra in a way. But of course, Al Green, less surprising, from Memphis, they were his idol. But they were here for about 6 years on WBIR, which is not otherwise known for innovative music. Brownie and Sig McGee were both born in Knoxville and were performing around here in the 30s and 40s in and out of town. Brownie McGee, of course, was known for playing with Sonny Terry. A lot of you may have seen him. He was here a few times later in his life, and had even a bit of a Hollywood career as well. His younger brother, Stick McGee, who's the guy on the right, is known is one of the forefathers of rock and roll, because he made a record called Drinkin' Wine Spodioti in 1946, re-recorded in 1948, and a much kind of a jump blues sort of style, kind of more upbeat, and some people consider that one of the very first rock and roll recordings. He unfortunately died very young of lung cancer. But Brownie became kind of part of the folk icons. Brownie McGee actually appears very briefly in the Bob Dylan movie with a brief speaking role. He's on when they're having a little kind of folk concert in a church. Brownie McGee shows up in there briefly. And very shifting gears in a big way is David Van Vactor, a modernist composer from Indiana, who came here and was always trying new things. He was at UT, but also the new conductor of the KSO. Bertha Clark was still there, but she was happy to take a seat and kind of semi-retire from conducting and became a cellist in Van Vactor's KSO. He was here longer than any other conductor, but he was known for trying out new things and kind of pushing the envelope with new music. And the Trialthal brothers, who were connected with being pioneers of electronic music, were his students from the 1940s and 50s. Don Gibson, who's a singer-songwriter. Some people question about how much of what songs he wrote, but he was very well known for a few songs, especially "Sweet Dreams," which was a big hit for Patsy Cline, and "I Can't Stop Loving You," which was Ray Charles' big hit. And unlike anybody else, he actually stayed in Knoxville after he was famous. Lived in West Hills, and he was here. I wish I could say things worked out great for him. He lived here he was from North Carolina, lived here for about 15 years, but he had a very troubled life. Had a very serious problems with drugs and personal relationships. But he's a tragedy waiting to be written. I understand there's a guy working on a biography of him right now. But he performed in rock and roll styles a little bit, and I'd like to mention Sam Morrison, who was not a musician. He was a record merchant on Market Square, over near where Preservation Pub is. And it was the fact that this new song in the summer of 1954 called "That's All Right, Mama," was suddenly a big hit, was selling reputedly by the thousands out of this one little record store run by a son of Jewish Eastern European immigrants, was what got the attention of RCA in New York, who decided we need to sign this guy. Interestingly, Elvis never performed here during the 1950s. I'm not sure why. But this event actually appears in his biographies because it was kind of the turning of the key that changed him. Almost all the rock and roll performers who performed in Knoxville in the 1950s were black performers, and that includes everybody from Fats Domino to Bo Diddley to Little Richard, Chuck Berry, all these folks, later Ike and Tina Turner, all these folks played at the Jacob Building. And I hope they remember that when they do the museum there, that it has that heritage there. This place had also been home, also had seen shows by Duke Ellington and many other people over the years. But I just want to mention that this is, things are changing in the mid '50s, and there to see it happen and to prod it along were the Everly Brothers, who were from a family gospel act who'd been performing up in Iowa for several years. They're from Kentucky originally, but they split off from the family after the first year or so in Knoxville, and began performing rock and roll on their own. They say, and they told the story themselves on stage at the Tennessee Theater a few years ago about how they went into Dugout Doug's record store. Anybody remember Dugout Doug's? It was on Cumberland Avenue, and kind of back at the end of an arcade. And Dugout Doug would sell records that nobody else would sell, and that included the earliest Bo Diddley records. And they got sent these Bo Diddley records that had this kind of Afro-Cuban beat to them, and they started playing their guitar like Bo Diddley, but also singing these beautiful gospel harmonies above that. And it was it was a new sound that was really caught on and made them major stars. And if you've ever been to the Everly Brothers Park, you know that they were a big influence on Paul McCartney, on Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, on Paul Simon. All these people wrote tributes just for Everly Brothers Park in Bearden. If you haven't seen it, go on your way home, drop in and just look at those inscriptions. It's kind of amazing what Graham Nash and his friends put together for us over there. But in fact, Paul McCartney said that he and John always were trying to sound like Don and Phil and Don, and respectively. That they were our biggest contribution, obvious contribution to rock and roll, other than Stick McGee anyway. Next, and this is our last one. Dolly Parton, of course, came out of the mountains, and she always credited her wonderful voice to her background and with her Welsh ancestors. And I would love to find some genealogy that connects them to the Isted Fods in Mechanicsville and that sort of thing. I hope some of her great grandmother may have come down to Mechanicsville for that in the 1890s. But of course, she's as a singer and a songwriter has been just a real phenomenon, and has changed the world of not just country but popular music in general. And I kind of stop it there because I'm seeing this. I don't know it's just me, but this era between the Civil War and the 1960s seems like the trunk of a tree, and after that, it's constantly evolving, changing. But after that, it's all branching out, and it's all flowers and leaves, and not the trunk anymore. So it's very hard, and this is my excuse, and I'm sticking to it. Talking to my friends who are musicians who've gotten some national attention, why they're not in the booklet, but the bulk of the story kind of begins with Gustavus Canava and ends with Dolly Parton. But the booklet literally opens with an unknown street musician and a statue of Sergei Rachmaninoff, which is the only one in the Western Hemisphere, by the way, and it's right down. On your way to the Everly Brothers Park, be sure and stop and look at the Sergei Rachmaninoff statue if you haven't seen it. It's kind of an amazing thing to have here. But anyway, we're up. I'm kind of skipping 50 years or so, but we're here with the Big Ears Festival, which I think kind of harks back in some ways to the Spring Festival of the 1880s. And here we have Donald Brown, great piano keyboardist and bassist from Memphis, and I think there's Greg Tardy behind him on saxophone and a few other guys. But they're old school jazz in some ways, but they also fit right into the avant-garde Big Ears Festival, which is the reason that Knoxville's famous for music globally today, and why places like the Bijou Theater and the Tennessee Theater are more famous today than they ever were in their histories. I was trying to trim this to 45 minutes, but I didn't. I don't know if we have time for I'm happy to entertain questions.
I'm fascinated by the history of James Brown in Knoxville.
Yeah.
If you could
I think James Brown has performed more, hardest working man in show business. Has performed more concerts in Knoxville than anybody else, except for local people, except for Harvey Morris or the Milet. He was here almost yearly for a long time. First at Chalway Park at the Jacob Building. The first time he played here, 59 or 60. But he was at Civic Auditorium, even though he was arrested there once, and he skipped it for a couple of years after that to show us something. But then he came back later. But
on the radio station?
he did. You're right. In fact, I'm glad you mentioned that because the radio station was right across the street in the same building where Bertha Wahlberg Clark started the Little Symphony. The radio station was in the basement later than her time, but in the 1960s, 1967, 68, WJBE. It's called the James Brown Experience, but I think he owned a few stations. It wasn't the only one he owned, but I think maybe 3 or 4 radio stations around the South. But that was we still have those call letters here in town on a radio station. But yeah, other questions? Okay, well thanks. Pick up a copy and I appreciate your coming out.